You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. A campaign called Lose the Lads Mags is underway in the UK to stop British supermarkets from selling magazines with nearly naked women on the front covers. Gender equality group, UK Feminista and anti-objectification organisation Object argue that lads mags are deeply harmful to women. Some equalities lawyers say displaying publications in the workplace or requiring staff to handle them may amount to sex discrimination and sexual harassment contrary to the Equality Act 2010. So to discuss the banning of lads mags from supermarkets is former editor of Loaded magazine, Martin Daubney, Kate Smurthwaite, who's a feminist writer and political activist, Dr. Peter Hegarty, social psychologist from the University of Surrey, and Nikki Hodgson, journalist and sex columnist for Men's Health magazine. Martin Daubney is the former editor of Loaded, which was first published in 1994. What is a lads mag?
A lads mag is a general lifestyle title that appeals to primarily young white men aged between 15 and 55. The vast majority of the audience being in their sort of teens and 20s.
What would you put on the front cover more often when you were editing it?
Well, when I was editor of Loaded, every month we had a girl on the cover. Quite simply, that was decided by market forces. When we asked our readers what they wanted, it was girls that they recognised from the television, famous celebrities that they knew, that they fancied, and that was the currency. It was no kind of insidious kind of pornographic sort of agenda going on. It's quite simply responding to market demand in the same way that The Economist might have David Cameron on the cover. Banning these magazines because a small vocal minority of feminist lobby groups don't like them, well, that's just not the free press that we have in our country. Our press is monitored by Leveson, before that PCC, the Press Complaints Commission. The UK men's magazine industry has the most tightly controlled industry in the entire Western world, second only to America, where the mags are placed in opaque bags because they're owned by, Walmart's owned by right-wing Christians. The only other countries in the world that do things like this are places like Iran, the UAE, China. And I really don't think that we should be going down the route of having a sort of censored press on account of the fact that a tiny minority of people find them offensive. And you have to ask the question, where would this end? If you don't like hunting magazines, for example, should we ban them? If you don't think it's fair that people should drive gas-guzzling cars, should we ban those magazines because they use too much petrol? Really, there won't ever be a case. When Object say that they claim to represent the workers of supermarkets, you've got to be very careful. They don't. Object go into into newsagents and do sit-in protests and pull magazines off shelves. That's an act of vandalism by any other name. They do not represent the workforce. They represent their own political interests, and they have a pathological hatred of the men's magazines, which has been going on for decades now. And, this is a really slow-moving car crash an argument that comes round every 18 months. It's been going on since Claire Short took on Page 3 in The Sun back in the 1970s. Nothing's happened since then. There will never be a legal case brought. In this case, mark my words, there is no legal precedent, and it's just censorship by any other name.
Thanks, Martin. Now, I want you to respond then, Kate Smurthwaite.
I don't think we can just dismiss them and go, well, this is trivial. I mean, if this is trivial, why are we all on Voice of Russia talking about it? Clearly they're having an impact because it's an issue that's out there and being discussed. Now, in terms of the specific legal situation, whether this legal case will run or whether it won't, I just can't comment on that. The answer is I don't know. This is there. Yeah, I heard you the first time, Martin. There's no need to interrupt. The point is I won't comment on where the legal case will go. Of course, when there's a legal case, both sides are entitled to be heard and to make their case. What I do think will happen is that the campaign and it's interesting because Martin immediately uses the word ban these things, but actually the campaign is to do things like get these magazines out of the eye line of young children. The campaign is to...
They already are at the eye line of children.
No, they're not.
In actual fact...
No, they're not. They're not, Martin. They're still sold. It's still absolutely legal to sell them at buggy eye level in supermarkets and newsagents, and many, many do. Some have stopped. WH Smith still does.
The big four supermarkets, and specifically
I'm
the
talking
legal
about
action,
WH Smith's.
the specific legal actions mentioned in the campaign was for the big four supermarkets.
Yeah, but I'm talking generally about...
Place the magazines behind modesty boards already. That's a voluntary agreement that the industry has with the retailers.
And why did that happen, Martin? Why did that happen? That happened because of a brilliant campaign by Object and Fawcett. And this is the next step of their campaign. And I think whether this is successful or not, the point is that the campaign will go on and inroads have already been made. I would point out that these lad mags mags, their readership is plummeting. It is falling through the floor. And the reality is, if they can take them out of the supermarkets, the next thing you know, they basically won't exist, not because of a ban, but because public demand will have dried up, because nobody wants to read this anymore.
But why should they be banned, Kate?
Well, I'm not saying they should be banned. What I'm saying is...
The campaign's called Lose the Lad Mags.
No.
What does that mean if it's not banning them? What does lose mean if it doesn't mean losing them from sale?
In the supermarkets.
So it means banning them.
OK, if I might be allowed to make a few points here, Martin. Interesting that your attitude to women is entirely summed up in the fact that as soon as I start talking, you shout over me.
No, I just want to tell the truth.
There you go again. Bingo. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Martin Daubney and his attitude to women. No, my point is that absolutely, I'm sure that Dr. Hegarty is going to expand more on this. The point is that we have seen a very clear link between a very negative attitude to women, and there is this sort of lad culture out there that didn't exist 50 years ago. It's very much a new thing, this idea of young single guys and this sort of expectation. And they send out some very negative messages, don't they, these magazines, about what women are supposed to look like, about body image, about all this kind of stuff.
Dr. Peter Hegarty, Kate mentioned you there, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the research you've done in the last couple of years about the link between lads mags and the perception of women and violence towards women.
What we did in our work is we did two studies. In the first, we took quotes that we'd either pulled from popular lads magazines like Loaded or from interviews with convicted rapists who were justifying their crimes of violence against women. In one study, we presented those quotes to young men on our campus, and we either correctly attributed the quotes, didn't attribute them to a source, or attributed them to the wrong source. By that I mean that we said the ones that we'd actually drawn from lads mags were from rapists and vice versa. In that study, what we found was that presenting those quotes as if they had come from a lads mags made them easier for young men to identify with. And in subsequent work that we've done here, which we haven't published yet, we've also found that young men feel that quotes that are presented as if they've come from a lads mag rather than from a neutral source are perceived as funnier and less hostile to women. So there's a framing effect there, right? So that's part of it. In the second study, what we did is we took the same quotes and we gave them to young men and women and asked them to rate them on a scale of how sexist they were, how derogatory towards women. And then we surprised them and said, actually, some of these are from lads mags, some of these are from rapists. Can you tell the difference? And they could not really sort those into categories an awful lot better than chance. So they were getting about, chance prediction is they would get 50% right, and they were getting about 55% right. So jointly, what we said was that there's an overlap here in kinds of discourse that you would see in editorials and advice columns in lads mags, and in the kinds of things that rapists say to justify their crimes, and also that this might be having an impact on the socialisation of young men, because these things seem easier to identify with if they're framed within the mainstream source of a lads mag, rather than coming from something that's quite an illegitimate source, like a convicted criminal. So that's what our research showed. We had quite a widespread response to it. So our initial media findings, and this is before we were on Australian radio or blogged in South Africa or any of that, so just in the first couple of weeks we reached over 6 million people with that message. And I think the sales of a UK lad mag are about 100,000 per issue. And the scale of the response was really quite interesting. We had a number of people look at the quotes because they were reproduced by a journalist called Anna North on Jezebel. And that was, I thought, quite nice what she did, because it allowed people to then sort of do the experiment on themselves and to form their own impressions of whether there was or wasn't an overlap and what they thought that meant for them. So a lot of people, both men and women of diverse ages, actually were quite surprised by the contents of these lads magazines and certainly thought differently because of them.
Do you think, with the evidence you've collated, that this campaign to stop these lads mags being sold in British supermarkets will have any impact on the link that you've discovered from your research, negative or positive?
That's a good question. I think I kind of want to sort of touch back on the question that the other two speakers seem to be debating, which is, what does it mean to, say, get the lads mags out? Does that mean that those lads mags should be banned and there should be censorship? Or are there other means by which lads mags might stop being in circulation. Earlier on, Martin mentioned market forces, and Kate mentioned the fact that the circulation of lads mags is declining, which is what I can see from the business pages as well. So the market forces seem to be moving away from these papers at this point in time. It could be that when people do or don't spend their money on these things, they're voicing one kind of public opinion, and it could be that the groups that are like Feminista and so on are voicing another form of that public opinion, which is people think these things are kind of distasteful and they don't really want them anymore.
I think if I might chip in, Peter, that actually the very important message, by taking these magazines out of the supermarkets, that would absolutely impact what you're talking about, the mainstreaming of the attitudes espoused by them. If we say, actually, these are not available, but you have to order these specially, or you have to go to some sort of specialist shop, that's sending quite a clear message. And actually,
or they just go online.
Well, and they do go online, but they're still then going to a specific site. Do you know what I mean? It's not quite the same as saying these are next to your groceries, is it? That sends out really quite a big message about this is normal, this is okay to have this attitude, this is an acceptable, normal thing, rather than this is a specialist thing that you have to go and look up, and this is only for a certain group of people who are interested in it. It kind of says, are you a normal guy? This is what you're probably into. Well, actually, taking them out of the supermarkets, I think, could have quite a significant impact on the way that those attitudes, and I quite agree with you, Peter, that very often when I see these things, it's very much not the images that bother me, it's the editorial tone that can be quite unpleasant.
I mean, I want to say this very clearly. I mean, I think, the one way that this debate gets framed is it gets framed around censorship and it gets framed around harm to children. And there's nothing in our research that addresses that in the slightest, although several people did pick it up as sort of reinforcing that message. There were other pieces of research that you could pick up, but the piece of research we did isn't one of them. I'm kind of concerned about harm to young men in this, and actually thinking about what this means about the socialisation of young men. And in that, I want to very much agree with you, Kate, that I think we need to separate out what's in the imagery and what's in the text. So, for example, I think it's not useful to have a public debate where we say if children see images of a naked woman, then they are harmed. That's not useful. It's not a useful framework, because that means that children who go on holidays with their mums in Spain and their mums go topless are harmed. And we know lots of mums who do that, and we know those children are not harmed, and that's not a useful way to set things up. But yeah, the kinds of quotes that we saw in lads mags, I think, are quite harmful, and for those to be in the mainstream, and particularly in advice columns for young men, is very, very different. So I think this debate, I'm in strong agreement with Martin that I think this debate is polarised and futile, because it in the way that it is, and until we start thinking in a serious way about our anxieties about how we feel about young men and their developing sexualities and how that's different from harm towards women, until we start to think about those in a more reasoned way, I don't think we're going to have a good public debate on this.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're talking about the campaign to stop lads mags from being sold in British supermarkets. Nikki Hodgson is a sex education columnist.
I very much myself as an anti-censorship feminist. I think Peter makes really good points about the imagery versus tone issue. And certainly what I find within my role with Men's Health magazines, although they're not a lads mag, they're certainly pitched, on the spectrum where some people would kind of find the tone slightly degrading potentially. They use sexualised images of women to illustrate certain articles. And what I'm able to do with my column is very much create a dialogue about sexuality between men and women, and open up discussion about what men think women like in bed and what women actually like. And I'm in a position to educate men about the realities of sex as opposed to pornographic representation. So I think I'm in a really lucky position to be able to do that. And if we're going to move forward on this discussion about a sort of conflict of the right to look and read this material and the right to be protected from it, then we need to get both sides in the argument. I was at a debate a while ago where Martin was speaking at a Women of the World conference in London, and the debate was about pornography. And I was actually aghast at how many people shouted him down before he even had a chance to put his points across, and also aghast at the level of dismay, hurt, general misinformation from a lot of the very strident feminists in the audience about pornographic material. And it was the younger generation that were coming forward and saying things like, well, actually, we like looking at porn and we like reading things like 50 Shades of Grey. And what we don't want is a banning of any kind of material whatsoever. What we do want is more engagement with it, and we want more things that are suited to us, and we want more agency in the production of sexually stimulating material and material relating to our sexuality.
To me, that seems a big gap somewhere, that boys growing up in the UK aren't finding what they need in terms of sex education. That has as much of effect on the way women are viewed as, in some ways, a campaign to remove scantily clad women on the front page of magazines from supermarkets.
This is a huge issue, and it's very much a related issue. But it's a huge issue, and that is the quality and provision of sex education in schools. In that, first of all, sex education is not even compulsory. These days, in the 21st century, parents can still take their children out of sex education in schools. And I hasten to add that the sort of parents who are going to take their kids out of that education are unlikely to be the ones who are going to say, listen, we're going to talk about this at home. It's very much the case. And now we've got increasing numbers of faith schools in the UK, and we hear a lot about the schools that aren't teaching evolution. They're teaching creationism. Well, if those schools are teaching creationism, what do you think they're saying about sex? It's not going to be a balanced thing. Yeah, exactly. But my point is that we have got a real problem with sex education not being done well, not being done thoroughly. And when that happens, a gap is created, and inevitably young people look round for information. And what is quite worrying is what is going to fill that gap. I would love to say parents are brilliant and they're going to turn around and give their kids all the information, and some parents are and some will. But a lot of young people are going to end up turning to magazines and things like this and seeing these images. And we've talked about the images, but ultimately, one thing I will say about the images in Lad Mags is that they're very, very similar. They don't show a range of different women. They show a very, very narrow selection of the population, and telling young men essentially, tangentially, this is normal, this is what you should expect, is quite a dangerous message, and it's going to lead to problems.
I just think that the whole attack on Lads Mags is somewhat quaint and misplaced, really. It seems like a sort of 19th century solution to sort of suggest banning men's magazines when the
sad this. You're attacking a complete straw man here. I haven't said ban them.
Lose the Lad Mag says one thing to me.
We have. But I'm not even a member of that campaign. We're talking about whether they should not be sold in supermarkets, and that's a whole different issue.
Earlier on, you were deriding me for interrupting you. Now you're doing the same.
But you're interrupting me right back, and you're misquoting me. I can't sit here while you misquote me.
The truth of the matter is, the vast majority of young men now are not turning their back on scantily clad images because we've quoted the sort of the decline of the men's magazine circulations. They are going online, and again, their sex education via online pornography. Yeah. And let's be absolutely honest. Focusing on men's magazines just seems to me somewhat pathetic and malicious when we're actually looking at a problem here which is far in excess of anything on offer in a men's magazine online for free with no age checks, no financial obligation and no surrender of details. We are talking about unrestricted access to genuinely misogynistic, hateful, harmful porn against women, where rape and enforced acts of hideous sexual depravity take place at the drop of a hat. Now, I think that's hideous. The UK men's magazines do not and have never portrayed anything of that nature. Really, it's like a kind of end of the pier postcard representation of nudity compared to what you can get online within seconds, 3 clicks from a Google search, and you're getting bestiality, child porn. Let's keep things in perspective. By chasing the men's magazines like this, I think you make yourselves look quite foolish. The problem is elsewhere. The battleground has moved on. Get in the 21st century.
But do you think alongside Kate's point, though, it's this sort of social normality of these lads mags sold in supermarkets where the casual depiction of a woman with very little clothes on is normalised? But I think then I go back to what Dr. Peter Hegarty was saying, was that we need to remove what the children look at and what is being sold, and actually look at the rape culture and the problem of what young boys are growing up with in society.
Martin described the panic about this as sort of 19th century and quaint, and I find Martin's concerns about men and boys looking at online pornography quite 19th century and quaint. Every time there's a new literary technology, there's a concern about men and boys and sex and masturbation. That's not new. It sort of happened with videotape, it happened with magazines, it even happened with novels in the early 19th century. Concerns about depravity, concerns about the power of the imagination. So we're seeing that with the internet as well here. I just want to come back again and say, you know, what we looked at was the verbal content in those lads magazine, not the content. So we're not looking at, you know, yes, you can probably find some quite... you can find bestiality and child porn on the internet if you look for it. I haven't, but I'm sure you can. But you can find a very wide range of porn on the internet, professional, amateur, all sorts of things. And I think you can probably find a wider range of bodies in there than you can find in lads mags. And that's a concern, I think. So I'm not sure, actually, that the internet pornography stuff is necessarily more harmful and more dangerous and worse than lads mags.
Well, I mean, it clearly is a bit bigger. The Children's Commission commissioned reports into this. There was one commission last month I read yesterday.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. We're talking about the campaign to stop lads mags from being sold in British supermarkets. I'm joined by former editor of Loaded magazine, Martin Daubney, Kate Smurthwaite, who's a feminist writer and political activist, Dr. Peter Hegarty from the University of Surrey, and Nikki Hodgson, journalist and sex columnist for Men's Health magazine.
I just wanted to say, the thing about representation is that there are plenty of countries in the world where the censorship requirements are such that you won't ever see sexualised images of women in the mainstream, but the attitudes to women still are absolutely terrible. I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. So the real issue is to do with education of attitudes of men towards women. That is what we have to get to, at the root of it. And I just feel the whole issue with the lads mags is that it's censorious and it's piecemeal, and it's not. What's it actually going to achieve? That's what I really want to know. What would it actually achieve if we did ban lads magazines or get them out?
Everyone is talking about banning, and nobody's asked to ban anything. We're talking about not selling them in supermarkets to send a message that this is not mainstream.
It's tantamount to banning.
No, it's not.
When you don't
it's not. There are lots and lots of things you can't sell in supermarkets. You know, they don't sell firearms because
magazines, they fall out of circulation.
Well, but isn't that an occupational hazard? Then they should improve their editorial content, and perhaps people will buy them again, or they should change the way they sell their magazines, and then they will be able to sell them in supermarkets again. That's like saying it's not fair that children can't watch horror films. Well, yeah, we decide on what's appropriate to sell in what environment. That's not about censorship. We're not stopping anybody from taking photos of their girlfriend doing whatever they want to do. If everybody's involved is consenting and enjoying themselves, great, go for it. We're talking about what message is sent out by the way that these things are distributed through mainstream corporations. And having regulations around the way corporations work is not the same as censorship.
What this campaign, Lose the Lads Mags, has achieved is the fact we are all here today talking about it and discussing it and looking at the issues surrounding the sexualisation of women, the objectification of women, and actually the need for better sex education for boys.
We need better sex education for boys, aware that sex education policy is often written in a way that's about keeping children ignorant. We should keep in mind there's a long history of that in Britain as there is in other countries. For example, consider Section 28, which made it illegal to talk about gay and lesbian relationships for a whole generation in Britain.
At the end of the day, what I'm seeing is that there's a campaign that says let's change the way that young women are presented in magazines and this kind of thing. And we keep talking. What has sort of hurt me about this discussion is we keep talking is what about young men and the way they're seeing this, that, and the other. And I just think, what about women? We're talking about a culture in which rape is still enormously prevalent and the conviction rate for it is appalling. And we need to re-educate young men, yes, but we need to do so because if we don't, we create an environment that just is not safe for young women, and I think that's what is terribly, terribly wrong about leaving things as they are and not tackling this problem.
Nikki Hodgson?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, in response to what Kate just said, I was an anorexic as a teenager and was very much influenced by women's magazines and the way they portrayed women's bodies. And it took me a long time to shake some of the attitudes that I had imbibed from those magazines. So my point would be, if we are going to start censoring or asking for certain magazines to be inhibited in certain ways, and we need to look at the broader picture of representation of women in general, which occurs, mainly through advertising, and we just need to, certainly with this issue about how women are perceived and how men consume their bodies sexually in presentation, we need to move the argument on and have women more engaged in production of their own sexuality.
Martin Daubney?
Quite simply, it's undemocratic, it's unfair, and it's censorious. The way that we work in Britain, we have a free press, something we should be tremendously proud of, and that's protected by Leveson. Before that, the PCC.
Leveson, they didn't even implement the recommendations of Leveson. Nothing is nothing has changed as a result of Leveson.
And nothing will change so long as a small minority majority of groups go around hassling retailers into losing magazine sales. That's not a free press. That's not what we do in Britain.
That is their expression of their free right to
And people are entitled
protest.
to buy men's magazines. It's a free country, and you do not and cannot and will not influence what the rest of us consume. That's not democracy.
The circulation of those magazines is plummeting, for the record. So somebody's having an impact.
They're going
and
online to get it.
Martin.
They're going online to get it for free. Let's get with the 21st century.
Which you think is wrong, because you said that earlier. So you think that there are dangers and risks around that.
It's market forces. It's happening.
Great. So rape is a factor of market forces. Hooray! Happy end to the interview.
Men's magazines.
That's just sick, Martin. That's absolutely sick.
No, it's not, because I did not say that. You're putting words in my mouth.
You are saying that rape culture is democratic.
No, I'm not.
And I think that women and men in this country deserve better than that.
I did not say that. What I said was, men's magazines prove to me that a men's magazine has made somebody go out and rape a woman. Prove the causality of that, because the Children's Commissioner can't prove that.
Dr. Peter Hegarty
has done shows that
lad mags are promoting rape culture. They show that they are a specific and key part of it. That's exactly what they show.
It showed that there was crossover in certain quotes, which, by the way, we didn't even hear the quotes. What were the quotes? I don't know what was...
Well, go and look at the article. It was on Jezebel. It went round everywhere. Everybody's seen the article. It's very widely distributed. I can't believe no one sent it to you, given your role in this whole situation,
The listeners of this show might not have heard, and it's grotesque to
go
try
and
and
look
put
at
words in my
Jezebel
mouth.
and do a search for lad mags rape culture, and it'll all come up.
To say that I condone rape culture is a grotesque affront.
You edit a magazine that publishes an editorial tone that scientific research shows is directly in line with the way that rapists justify their crimes. If that isn't condoning rape culture, Martin, I just don't know the word for it.
Because there's no proof that anyone went out and raped a woman having looked at a men's magazine. It's just 2 + 2 = 8.
Statistically, it seems quite likely, doesn't it?
It doesn't. It's not true. Prove it.
Well, sorry. Go on, Dr. Peter Hegarty.
Can I jump in here? This is an important question that we need to come back to. Both of them are right. It is one thing to say that these magazines promote rape culture and promote violent attitudes towards women. It is another thing to say that they are responsible for any individual man's crime.
Right, but I haven't said they're responsible for individual. I said they're a part of rape culture.
No, I want to let...
I need to come in
I want Dr. Hegarty to speak.
To say what the evidence actually says. Okay, because that's my job, and that's my job ethically to do that. And this has gone wrong before, and this has gone wrong if you look at the way psychological evidence was used in arguments about censorship of pornography in the United States in the 1980s, and we are replaying that with such tragic historic consequences here. Right? So we are saying something important, we are saying something about social influence, but we are not saying something that would either satisfy Martin's idea about nature and market forces and the naturalism of all that, or that would satisfy what Object is saying about the direct causality. We're saying something more...
I don't think Object is saying anything about direct causality. I don't think you can misquote Object and just leave that as the final word on here.
Who's misquoted Object?
Peter just has, saying that they're talking about direct causality, and they've said no such thing. They're talking about rape culture, and they've always talked about rape culture.
That makes sense. That makes sense. If we're talking,
great,
we can
we're
talk
in agreement.
About I think what we're talking about is changing norms so that certain sorts of things become, as you would say, mainstream. I would say normalised, and so on and so forth. That's what our evidence has shown. But there has been a strong desire in the past to get psychological evidence to say that pornography leads men directly to rape. There's loads of experiments teasing out that very question. We didn't do that research, and we are not saying that in this research. And I think I need to be clear on that, because this debate can get polarised and psychological evidence can get misinterpreted. So sorry if that sounded like a misquote, Kate. It certainly wasn't intended to be.
Okay, no, fair enough. I think we're actually all in agreement here that it's part of rape culture.
Kate Smurthwaite, feminist writer and political activist there. And I'd also like to thank all my guests, former Lads Mag editor Martin Daubney, social psychologist Dr. Peter Hegarty, and sex education columnist Nikki Hodgson.